So you can't be a property investor unless you can get access to the money that you need to continue to invest. And for most people, that means access to lending. So we just had a client, let's call him Tim. So Tim had been dealing with 2 banks and another broker for a process of about 3 years and had been told consistently that he could not buy another property. Now, at a brief look at Tim's numbers at a higher level, everything should have worked. But not all banks and not all funders have the same serviceability calculations. So his existing bank and broker were only using a very narrow band of lenders. But the reality was Tim knew that he could afford the next property, but no lender could make sense of his incomes, how they were received, and how we could leverage a little bit harder in order to achieve the next purchase. So let me tell you a little bit more about Tim's backstory. So Tim already had 5 investment properties. So he's an established investor. He has very small to little owner-occupied debt. He had a series of investment properties that rented really, really well. Some of them even had 2 rents per property. And all in all, his property was largely cash flow positive. Now, you all know why this doesn't work with a major lender, and it doesn't work because the major lender will apply buffers to your existing borrowings and also shave down your rents and then shave down your incomes in order to meet their servicing criteria. The strengths in Tim's portfolio was that he had good solid rents, a reasonable loan to value ratio, and very little owner-occupied debt. So what we were enabled to do was to use these strengths to a lender that has an appetite for this kind of client. Now, how did this look? So what it looked like was we used some cash that Tim had to extinguish the remainder of the owner-occupied debt. We then withdrew that owner-occupied debt as a form of debt recycling, and then that gave Tim the deposit that he needed for the next investment property. We then went to a lender. In this instance, it was First Mac, and that lender doesn't buffer the repayments that he's making on his other loans. They just take the actual repayments into the servicing calculation. So what that meant was that Tim could then borrow more money than he'd been told ever before by his existing broker and by the other 2 banks that he was consulting. So this then enabled him to go and make another purchase. And that purchase was for a really good blue chip style property in a really great area. Tim's absolutely going to make some capital growth on this over the next 5 to 10 years. Now the question is, why do most investors miss this opportunity? Why do most brokers potentially miss this opportunity? Well, let's think about this particular scenario. Obviously, that other lender is a non-deposit taking institution, so the rate's going to be slightly higher. The loan that Tim took out was about $700,000. So if he's paying an extra 1% interest on the money, that last purchase is actually cost him, say, an extra $7,000 a year over and above what a normal lender would choose. But as I said before, it's a blue chip investment. So is it going to go up more than the $7,000 a year that he's paying in extra interest? Of course it is. But quite often, investors and brokers get so caught up in the rate that they forget what the client's actually trying to do. We're trying to buy assets. We're trying to buy assets that go up in value, and we're trying to create long-term wealth. Sometimes interest rate is the thing that you have to forego. No one gets a full bag of sticks. Sometimes it's not always going to be perfect, but if you can get your scenario 90% perfect, well then that's sometimes enough to proceed with the new purchase. Now, giving up on interest rate being the be all and end all for some people is a very much life-changing event, because from the time that they were young, they always got told, get the best interest rate possible, get the best deal possible. But you got to remember, the deal is the overall deal, right? There is no deal if you can't borrow the money. So if you can borrow the money and it's at a slightly higher interest rate and that gets a deal done, sometimes that's the best result for you. So if this situation sounds familiar to you, maybe it's worth checking your situation. Maybe it's worth checking with a couple of different lenders. Maybe it's worth looking at alternate lending options to get your next investment property purchased.